What up, y'all? I'm Dr. CBS here with my girl, Dr. Layla Brown, and you're tuned into season 2, episode 14 of The Last Hope Intellectual. R.I.P. Glen Ford.
All right, y'all. So before we get into this week's Shoot the Shit, we want to shout out one of our new patrons, show regular Leah Boggs Jackson. Thanks for giving us your coins, and thanks as always for helping us to pay our producer, Too Black. Okay, so this week's episode is focusing on the collection of pieces by Glen Ford, The Black Agenda. And so for our Shoot the Shit today, we wanted to talk about something that comes from the foreword, which was written by Margaret Kimberly. And so I'm going to read a quote first, and then we'll get talking. So Margaret Kimberly says that Glen Ford is irreplaceable, not just because his writing was so sharp and so clear, but also because his politics were so clearly of the left. He was not a liberal or a Democrat or a progressive. He was a Marxist, and he brought that ideology to all that he did. In so doing, he revealed important information that is regularly disregarded or disappeared. He also had a talent for making every issue understandable and making connections with the reality of people's lives. When he spoke of the political duopoly, the Republicans and Democrats who provide political theater as they do the work of the ruling classes, no one was confused about what they were witnessing as large numbers lost their homes in the financial crash of 2008 or were forced to take low-wage work or even gig work, the culmination of capitalist intent for everyone else in the world. So we wanted to kick off this Shoot the Shit by just talking a little bit about Glen Ford, his legacy. And I think that this quote from Margaret Kimberly is a really good place to start. So what stands out for you all from this quote?
So I think that first and foremost, part of what Margaret Kimberly is talking about is Glen's just his clarity, his courage, and also it is very clear not only in how he labels himself a Marxist, but in his actual analysis. And so there's just so much, y'all, I promise I'm not gonna cry. I'm gonna try my best not to ugly cry, but there's just so much about Glen, I think, that journalists need to embody, but also any of us who claim to be knowledge producers, right? We have to be clear in our analysis. We have to be internationalists in our scope, have a historical perspective, and also have the courage to name our ideology and not hide behind the vagueness of progressive or left or radical in terms of how they can operate and what they mean. And so that means that we actually have to convey what our politics are and what our ideology is in the way that we write and analyze, and also the things that we care about. So that's sort of what initially comes to mind.
I mean, there's two things. I mean, with him, obviously, he was just always really clear, where who he was and where he stood. But I think, like we said, the actual analysis that informed it, and you could always tell, and he did not ever stray away from it. So I think CBS said certain information came into the conversation that didn't come into the conversation when people are coming from a more idealistic standpoint or just a typical liberal lens. And he always, he always followed the money. And I think anybody that practices Marxism well follows the money. To just kind of just break it down. So it was never I know we'll get to it later with the back and forth with him and Bruce Dixon, but it was never just, oh, you're not Black enough, or, they're not down, or some of these kind of abstract terms, you took money from Wall Street, and now you're in office and you're working for Wall Street. And this is the destruction that working for Wall Street does. So for myself, who had no clue about any of this shit when I was much younger, when I first was introduced to Black Agenda Report, I didn't have a Marxist analysis or anything. But even before I knew that's what he was, it helps embed it in me. So I think it's a lot of times today we're really big on naming that we're radical or whatever, but is it in your analysis? When I actually read or listen to what you're saying, can I see it there? Because for someone like I said, my 18-year-old self who doesn't know anything about that, I'm getting it not because he's telling me, but because he writes it into his actual pieces, right? And I think that's much more powerful than just, you know, I'm this or I'm that. Because I listen to people all the time now that I know what the distinctions of these things. I'm like, you sound really idealist, regardless of whatever, you know, left claim you taking on. Like, and he just didn't do that. So I think beyond just him as an individual, but I just think it's important. You can call yourself what you want, and it's important to name yourself, but it's also important to make sure that actually shows up in the material world, especially if you're saying you're a Marxist. You know, it needs to show up in your actual material work.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the other things that I appreciate, and this came up a few weeks back in our conversation with Amanla, also because of his transition from journalism to the academy, is that I really appreciate, you know, what Margaret calls out here about his clarity, right? I had the opportunity to be interviewed by him not long before he passed. And one of the things that I really appreciated, and I think CBS and I tried to, you know, do our own version of that even in our interviews. I really appreciated the way he asked questions. And it was very clear that when he asked questions, he asked questions with the point, right? And so what I appreciate about journalism, and his journalism in particular, is that I think oftentimes when it comes to complex issues, you know, we as academics are not the first line. Often people become exposed to these things through journalism, right? And when I say that, I mean the public become exposed to these complex issues through journalism. And I think that there is something, there's a gift in being able to convey a very complex, you know, multi-layered, with many parties, things happen in terms of, you know, here Margaret Kimberly gives the example of duopoly, but to be able to explain these types of complex phenomena in a way that allows your audience to say, okay, this is clearly what the problem is, and to ask questions of the people who you are utilizing to bring more information to that allows them to get at that. I think that there is something there that is both a gift and a craft. And I say that to say that it is something that, you know, some people are good at, but that other people are good at and work really hard at. And I think that because of Glen Ford's mission, it was important to him to ask hard-hitting questions, both of himself and the people that he interviewed, to be able to make certain claims. And I think that that's something that's really important. And I think that, you know, he offers an opportunity for us to think about the interesting ways that these public mediums like journalism are able to be in conversation with the sometimes obscure, sometimes not always accessible interworkings of, you know, academic writings and texts. And so there's something that I think is really important there about the work that he's doing, for the work that we are doing, and ultimately for the goal that we want to accomplish, which is Black freedom, Black liberation.
I was just laughing because I was thinking about I think we all have had the sort of opportunity and pleasure of being interviewed by Glen. And one of the last interviews that we did, I just remember we both just kept fucking up. And it was so funny. And I felt terrible because Glen edited all his own shit. And so when Jemima Pierre, Peter Hudson, and I started the Black Agenda Review, part of what we were doing, what we were also trying to do is get him an intern to like that sort of minutia so that he can focus on like other things. Because he was not only doing the radio show, but also writing for Black Agenda Report every single week. So anyway, I was like, man, you got to edit all this shit. I'm so sorry. But a lot of people talk about Glen, because Glen he did not suffer no fools. And, you know, he was tough, but he was so incredibly kind. I just never saw that caustic side of him. And I don't know if it was like a generational thing, that he wanted to sort of preserve his like most kind self for younger people. I don't know, but he was always so kind and hilarious. And so even after we interviewed, we chopped it up for like an hour, right? You know what I mean? He just was so kind. And I think that that's a really hard balance to have, is a sort of like, you know, patience and kindness, but also be like, but fuck you too. You know what I mean? And so like, and I think that that's a model, you know, I have a very caustic personality too. And so one thing that I love about Glen and people like Glen is just that it's like, okay, you can actually just do this. Like you can actually just be yourself and be radical, be like, fuck that. But also have a kindness and patience for the people. You know what I mean? So like, I was just thinking about that as you were talking about interviewing with him.
No, I was gonna also just add one of the things that happened in our interview. He was struggling with his voice towards the end, and not that, you know, I think we always talk about what it means to, you know, take a rest, take care, take time to, you know, rest and recuperate. But I do think that, like you said, it was the point you made about the generational thing that kind of stuck out to me, is that there is something there that even as he was dealing with his own health issues towards the end, that this was work that he was committed to. And even, I mean, literally, the man was interviewing me and struggling to talk, right? Struggling, you know, with his own vocal cords, but still wanted to have a full conversation, wanted to ask questions, you know, wanted to be very clear and direct. And so I do think that there is something about that type of commitment, patience, and professionalism. And I don't mean professionalism in any sort of, you know, I don't know, broke, respectable kind of, yeah, not like that, but a type of professionalism that say, you know, there's something bigger here, and I want to get this in while I still can.
And do your fucking job. And the other thing too is generosity. So maybe I meant generosity, kindness too, but generosity. But yeah, but even when he was finishing up this book in a hospital bed, you know what I mean? Like, who the fuck works like, and again, it's not that sort of like capitalist grind or die culture. It's like, this is the work. This is a commitment. And I think that that's the sort of difference, that work ethic, like for the people, not for his own self-aggrandizement. Yeah.
I mean, even his writings, they were always so precise. Like anytime I would get in arguments with people, like, what did he say wrong? You know, because he like you may not agree, which is different, but like, what did he get wrong? Like he could tell you more about yourself if he was criticizing you, maybe than you knew about yourself. I mean, he was always gonna corner it. They talk about, you know, in journalism, like you kind of get a circle around something or around a topic. Like he was always gonna get all the information that was necessary to explain why whatever you were on was bullshit, or why this didn't work or whatever. Like he was, you know, it was always so precise. Like and to do that, like, I mean, it's hard to write shit. Y'all know more than me. Like it's just hard to write shit in general. But to do that like every week consistently for that long, you know, again, it's not about creating some like kind of like, you know, capitalist hero, but I'm just saying, like, there is something to be said. I don't think we talk about enough on the quote unquote left, or whatever you want to call it, about what work ethic does look like, and when it's dedicated to something bigger than you. Like, what does it look like to not always just be wallowing in your pain necessarily, but to know that, yeah, I have pain and that's caused by the world or whatever, but we still have a job to do if we care about this struggle. And I think that, like you were saying, like because I had the same thing. I mean, that's when he told me that he had cancer. The last interview the only interview that I did with him, like he told me at the end, after we just did everything, and he's like, I just got my voice, you know, I just had that operated on, and, you know, I found out I got cancer. He was just kind of, you know, I mean, clearly he wasn't happy about it, but he still was going. He was, and you know, and I'm sitting there like happy that we did the interview, you know, because I mean, this is like a dream for me. I don't have many dreams, you know, but this was like a dream for me. And then he tells me that, and it's just like, wow. But it was saddening, but it was also like wow at the same time. Like you're still going, you know, like you. And he didn't miss a beat, you know, like that was another thing. If he interviewed you, he read your work and he knew all the references, and he'd remind you of stuff that you said or put it better than you said it. So, you know, like, so yeah, I mean, that it's just an example. I think, like, we still need, like, I know we beat up on a lot of the mainstream stuff. We still need role models. We still need quote unquote representation, and not in the way that they do it, but we still need things that give us an idea, like how to move around in life. And I just think he provided that for us, for those of us who call ourselves radicals or whatever. Like, he provided that for us. And I think sometimes it was a mark that some people couldn't meet, because you really did have to be disciplined. Like, you couldn't just say I'm this and then it just works. Like, I'm Black and radical. No, you had to hold a certain line for him. And if you didn't hold it, he was going to come for your head. You know, I mean, I was just reading it through the book again. I was just laughing. Like, I forgot he has so many lines, like, you know, it would just come from people's head. Like, you know, I think,
bars.
yeah.
When he said that these people hoard for Bloomberg, I was like, oh God, because he's the one that came up with Cory Booker, corporate hooker too. He did have bars, but I think that when you say role model, I think that's right. Or for me, it's like people who model the work. Like, how do you do the work, right? And the other thing too about it is like it's thankless. You know, Black Agenda Report 1 winning all these awards. It should, you know, but it's not getting no accolades. They're not getting lifted up on by any celebrities or anything like that. But it's like it's the work and it's important. And therefore, and he didn't expect any of that shit. You know what I'm saying? Like Glenn could have he could have been rich. Okay. The man is brilliant. He's a hard worker.
He was better than all the people he talked about. Like, so, you know.
He's better than everybody, but he just did you know what I'm saying? And so I think that, you know, we've talked about on the show, like class suicide, our responsibility to the people, understanding that what we have comes from movements. He just did that shit. And he wasn't like, hey y'all, I'm for the people, I'm embodying the work. He just did his work. And yes, he dragged your ass. And the other thing too is like, I've heard several of like his contemporaries or people who've been in various organizations with them talk about how mean he is. But people confuse niceness with ethics. I don't give a fuck if you're mean. I guess because I'm mean, but like he was ethical and principled. That doesn't mean you have to be nice. I think you need to be able to work with people. So you have to be comradely. But again, that doesn't mean nice. And that's that liberal abstraction that people have to be nice and get along, and that, you know, doing this work is a family. It's not a fucking family. Your family is your family. The workplace is not a family, and your organizing circles need not be your family. And you need to tell the truth. And I think that we so often are not told the truth that it comes off as meanness. But I don't think that he didn't have is it ad hominem? You know, I mean, he called a few names here and there, but it wasn't ad hominem attacks. But I think that they were character, in a sense, they were character attacks in the sense that the poor character is embodied in the politics. It's embodied in the alignment with the ruling class and your failure of the people, right? And so I always think about that too, that like, listen, do you, like, be who you are, but be principled, be ethical, and do the work, you know?
Well, I was going to go in slightly different direction, because one of the things that came up for me in both the forward and the intro, and I know CBS and I have different views about the work of biographies, memoirs, autobiography, not so much biographies, but memoirs and autobiographies. But I don't know. I'm a person that always appreciates understanding how people come to learn the lessons that they then later embody.
Layla, let me just stop you real quick, because guess what I wrote on that first page? I said, my kind of memoir. My kind of memoir, because it's not salacious. He's not dumping his fucking purse out. He's like, this is what you need to know about Glen Ford. So yes, I'm with you.
Yeah. And so I mean, for those in the audience who haven't read it, you know, he talks about his own upbringing, his father's own work as a radio broadcaster, you know, his family's work doing different types of organizing. And for me, that's something that always resonates with me, because I don't say this to say, obviously, you do not have to come from a family of organizers to be politically active or anything like that. However, I think it's always important to know that, like, when we create a particular kind of environment, certain types of work and life can thrive in that. And I think that that's something that we should all be striving to do, whether we have kids, biological kids or not, that we should be working to create environments and other types of examples for people to see that they want to live and work that they want to replicate. And that's part of what I see in the way that Glen tells the story of who he was raised to be and how he came to be. And I think that there's something there that we can continuously learn from.
Yeah, I mean, like we haven't talked about this explicitly, but like when him and the entire Black Agenda Report staff took the line on Obama, you know, they were getting more support, not mainstream, but they were getting, more support on around the edges before they took that line. And I think that, as we'll talk about with other things, like holding that line, age is better than just running with the trend. But at the time, I remember just from the stuff I knew, and I was young, like, I'm, freshman, sophomore year, whatever in college, but I'm just watching like how people were just completely leaving them on an island, and particularly him, because Obama was the thing and everybody ran for it. And I always bring this up because I don't think people understand.
Dick riding Obama.
Yeah, I put that in the last episode. but I don't think people understand just like how bad it was. Like, I don't even think people who were there remember sometimes just how like caught up. Like, he caught it. I remember he caught it like the delusional. He said black people were delusional, and it wasn't. Sometimes people use that word and it's over exaggerated, but we really were like delusional. Like, and I remember when I would argue with people, like we were talking about in the last episode, like when we were talking about Obama or putting his handcuffs out or whatever, like people would be ready to fight you over this shit. Like, so to write a column every week, that was relentless, and that didn't let up. But then it gives us something to go back and read when we're trying to understand the times. Like that archive is so important because it didn't sell out to just the praising of the moment, just the groveling. Like, all of that stuff reads horrible today. I'm sure even some of the people who did it aren't proud of those groveling articles and all that they wrote. But you read his stuff, it still holds up. And that's another thing about like good work, is that shit holds up. Like it gives us lessons when we're in a different time period. Like, we can go back and give us some context. And I think if you're a journalist, a writer, an artist, anybody who does work that gets archived, like that's what you want, is for people to go back and be able to take lessons from it, as opposed to doing that microwave shit. Ain't nothing we can do with that. It's like pop music or something. Like, it was cool. It was snap music in the day. And it was, it's nostalgic at best, but ain't nothing we can do with it. You know what I mean? But like the stuff that's real, like you can really like work with that, So it's like that stuff on Obama, like all holds up. And then the times always catch up with you. So eventually now people will talk about Obama with drone strikes and all of this. Like, he was saying all that early. And I'm not saying this to say he was the first or whatever. I'm saying like he just held the line though. He held the line, like you said. And it's like, that's what you got to do.
Black first, yeah. It's like, where the fuck was your antennas when everybody, what is it, change gonna come? People was playing like change gonna come and crying and shit, and like,
listen, when we were reading
the fucking electric slide, all that.
For this, in my notes in the call, I was literally like, how the fuck did the world get caught up in the notion that Barack Obama was ushering in a post-racial moment? Like, I just like the hubbub over post-racial America in 2008, and not just like in popular shit. Like, it was a whole, I don't know, you probably remember CBS because we were both in grad school at the time. Like, it was a whole wave of people coming in to write books and study post-racial America as if that was a fucking thing. And like, nobody talks about that shit anymore. But it just, I had a chill down my spine when I read that and was reminded of that narrative at that time.
Somebody like Glen Ford points to me or like makes me feel reassured in not being part of that, because I just was not, and it's because I'm a curmudgeon, a cynic, all whatever you want to call it, but like I'm not usually, especially the pop culture shit, I'm just rarely part of that. And like, you can feel like what's wrong with me, right? You can feel like, damn, what should I be doing? Am I doing a disservice? Like, should I, like, am I just talking shit? Am I a hater? Like, but somebody like Glen Ford, who holds the line, even when everybody else is, has jubilation, and you're like, no. Like, I think that we need those people, when like you're talking about role models, I think that just as people can find jubilation in like the sort of, Black Panthers of the world and Obama or whatever, we need people like Glen Ford that we can be like, yeah, Glen Ford just dragged such and such by their edges. And like, we need those people too, because it is hard. It's like 12 of us, literally, you know what I'm saying? And people might think they identify with us, but they, you know what I mean?
And
so
it's even harder when you're young, like when you were talking about your professors and shit looking at you, like it's even harder when you feel like not only do I have a critique of this, but people are discrediting me not on the basis of what I'm actually bringing to the table, but because of all these other factors. Like,
they think it's
you
youth
just haven't seen,
idealism.
yeah,
You ain't lived yet or whatever.
But I mean, like I think Baldwin talks about the price of the ticket, you know, in regards to doing the work. So like he paid his price, like he, you know, but he put it in. Like it's just because like both of y'all are saying, like, and I'm not trying to turn us into these like, oh, we were so victimized by Black people. I'm not trying to do that either. But it's like the shit that people say to you when you don't take the popular line, not just with Obama, but with a lot of stuff. Like you do have to get over yourself very quickly, or you're not going to do well. Like, because I mean, Hood Comments talked about being called genocide deniers. You know, like you, if you don't go with some of the typical Black lines, like it's not that you're just a hater, you're a traitor. You know, like people treat you like you're a traitor to Black folks when you don't take certain lines sometimes. And that's his own conversation to have as far as what that means. But like, if you don't hold what people think is pro-Black, which I don't like that term because it's such an abstract thing. It can be anything you want it to be anyway. But like, you know, if you don't hold that line, like, you know, and so it's like, if you're only just caught up on yourself and how people see you, like, you're not going to be able to hold up. Like, it has to be about something more than just yourself. It has to be about whatever that line is and whatever that principle is. And because you love Black people, and I think Glen Ford loved Black people at the end of the day, even when sometimes they didn't love him back, you know, you have to be able to hold that line. So I'm saying, like, that's a role model. That's an example. That's all those things.
Love us in spite of ourselves.
Yeah. And I think that's a good lesson, because even though he was really hard on Black people, probably more than most, like, you know, he still loved Black people, you know. And I think that's all you can ask for, whether you agree with someone or not. Like, that's all you can ask for. Like, if you don't have that at the foundation, you know, then everything else isn't going to work out anyway.
Right on.
My brother.
All right, y'all. So it is time for this week's planting. I can't. All right, y'all. It's time for this week's planting thoughts. So for this week, we have one of my favorites, the Calipia zebrina. So, a funny story. This was in a pot, and I had my window open, and the wind knocked it over, and so my pot broke. So now it's just in the planter. But I will say this, and I haven't said this about other plants. The good thing about the planters is that if any of you are having issues with gnats, they allow you to bottom water. And so, like, I have this little glass thing, and I set it in it, and I'll just pour water in the bottom instead of at the top, which helps prevent the soil from getting too wet, and then letting gnats breed. But anyway, so this week's plant is the Calipia zebrina. It's native to Brazil. It's an evergreen perennial, which means that it survives for at least about 2 years. Granted, you know, if you take care of it. So this particular plant, it needs a lot of bright light, but indirect light. So the direct light can tend to burn the leaves a little bit, but it needs a lot of light. It actually does well with a good deal of humidity. When I was back in Boston, I like to give my plants humidity baths. So I would, when I would take showers, I would bring the plants into the bathroom with me and let the steam, you know, get to them, or I had humidifiers around them. This particular plant is non-toxic to humans and pets, so it's a good one. I like this one because it is in the prayer plant family. So one of the things that happens with this plant is that at night, the leaves close up. And then in the daytime, when the sun is out, they tend to go down. But this is one of the easier ones in the prayer plant family to maintain, because as long as you make sure it's watered regularly, even it'll let you know the leaves will start to curl up when it has not had enough water. And within a day or two, if you make sure you water it again, they'll be back to looking bright. And these kind of have a velvety finish. So this is one of my favorites. This week's plant of the day, the Calipia zebrina.
right, y'all. So to continue our discussion of Glen Ford, we're going to do it in the segment History of the Present, where we talk about a past or historical quote or reading and then bring it up to our current moment. And so Glen's book is not, it just dropped, but it is a compilation of many of his articles throughout the early 2000s, I believe, mostly in the 2000s. And so it's recent history, but it's still history. And because of the way he analyzes so many of the important events, issues, and circumstances that affect not only Black people in the US, but the Black world and the world writ large, it is a very important historical text, right? And so that is what we are going to focus on. And again, it is this book, The Black Agenda. And so each of us we've all sort of honed in on a few articles that we pulled out of the text that we'll discuss, but Two Black, run it.
All right, so I'm gonna start with probably some of the most recent stuff he wrote relative to maybe some other things we end up talking about. Even this is more in like 2015, but like we were saying, when you hold the line, another upside to that is your predictions or your analysis is usually ahead of where a lot of people are. So when you go back and read stuff like this, it's interesting to see how now we're here. So he had a piece, Black Lives Matter and the Democrats, how disruption can lead to collaboration. And I'm sure those who are listening or watching the show have seen or at least heard about some of the recent articles that have been released about Black Lives Matter, whether that's the Foundation or Campaign Zero. So he was on top of this in 2015 when we were all, now I will own that one, we were all caught up a little bit on the movement or whatever. So
not the girl.
I'll own that one. So a quote from the article, and then I'll just give like a brief synopsis, and then we can have a little discussion on it. And again, I want people to think about how this relates, to today. But Black Lives Matter activists may convince themselves that they are confronting the ruling class electoral duopoly by disrupting presidential candidate speeches, but the tactic leads straight to co-optation. So there he's already talking about co-optation. What is the purpose? If BLM goal is to push the candidate to adopt better positions on criminal justice reform, what happens afterwards? The logic of that tactic leads to either a direct or indirect implicit endorsement of the more responsive candidates. Otherwise, why should BLM or the candidates go through the exercise? So in the piece, and some of y'all might remember this, in the 2016 presidential election, in the primaries for the Democrats, Black Lives Matter activists started interrupting, like they would go and disrupt a speech or a rally for a particular candidate. And I think, remember, even in the Bernie Sanders one, they actually went up and like took the mic. And a lot of people thought at the time that this was militant, that this is radical, that this was showing that there was this new movement, and this has already been going, Black Lives Matter had already been going up to this point, but this was another iteration of it. And so they would push them, and, talking about Black Lives Matter activists will push these candidates, but they didn't really have, and this is Glen's main critique, they didn't have any demands. They would just be like, what are you going to do for Black people? And they would just leave it up to the politicians to come up with some kind of solution or whatever. What do you got for criminal justice reform? That was the main thing that they were talking about. And this was definitely when BLM was in its more reformist, as far as ideologically speaking, nobody was even talking about abolition other than some activists under the current, but the general message was still very reformist. I don't think it was ever anything other than reformist, honestly, but the language was reformist, I should say. So again, Ford is really pushing them on like, what are your demands? If you don't have any demands, and if you're not in connection with the people, then ultimately you're just a lobbyist group. So it might seem like, because it's confrontational, and a lot of times we confuse if something's confrontational, then automatically it's seen as radical. But yeah, it's confrontational, but it's like, you're just saying, hey, what's your reform? So that leaves it up to the candidate to be like, okay, well, we're just gonna do, like today, no knock warrants, which we don't even uphold, or we need to reduce marijuana arrest or whatever. So they interrupted the former mayor of Baltimore, O'Malley, and Ford noted in the piece, his administration had arrested over 750,000 people, more people than existed in the entire city of Baltimore. And this is someone you're asking to come up with some kind of reform agenda that shows that, he was ahead on this critique. Like, he's calling co-optation out, and he's showing you, again, we're talking about the analysis. He's showing you how that functions. He's not just saying these people are sellouts. He's saying, like, when you approach it this way and you don't have any demands and you don't have a worldview, like you don't have a real hard line to hold, you open it up to your oppressor to give you a solution. And I think that's largely what happened. So a few questions. How important is it to have your own political commitment that goes beyond the dominant political parties? And then we talked about this a little bit earlier, but was the early reticence by some Black millennials to criticize Black Lives Matter tied to a sentimental yearning for a modern day civil rights movement? And if so, what role did identity reductionism play in that?
I think that's your question about identity reductionism and just, wanting something. I mean, I think it's that, but I also think that that's where people are ideologically. Like, I think that, like, as Glen Ford says elsewhere, like in the 1980s and 1990s, especially after the apartheid movement sort of died down, like the movement was it was dormant, right? He didn't say it was dead. He just said it was dormant. And so people were just, even in this moment, are still just beginning to sort of hone a political consciousness or a political analysis. And so I think that literally is where people are. And because of the success of multiculturalism and particular types of abstract identity politics, or what we call identity reductionism, I just really think that that's where people's political consciousness or political analysis is. And I think Black Lives Matter was an enunciation of political development at that moment, especially among younger folks.
A couple of things came to mind. The critique that Glen Ford launched in terms of, what it means to be disrupting, in particular, these candidate forums, right? And so then the barometer becomes who responds in a better manner to the disruptions. The perfect example of that was Bernie Sanders, right? Because the shift that he made his second time around was in making more room for campaign disruptors, right? Was in directly responding to them. And again, I think Bernie Sanders' campaign for presidency brought some interesting contradictions to the fore and brought some other important things. One of the things that we can say, which is just true, is that socialism has not existed in the popular lexicon in the way that it does now prior to Bernie Sanders' campaign. That having been said, he was still very much a part of that
Right.
electoral machine, right? And so that he's an interesting example of that. And I think there was even an incident with Hillary Clinton that was similar to that.
Yeah,
He wrote a
piece on that too.
Yeah. But what I will say to your questions, so the first one, how important is it to have your own political commitments? I mean, this is what we talk about all the time, right? Like, it is of the utmost importance for us to be able to determine, and the thing is, the political commitments, we have to always see that the political commitments are always future oriented. If we limit our political commitments to the way things are now, we'll never be able to see and envision something different, right? We have to be able to have something in mind beyond what is now. In terms of how people responded to Black Lives Matter, I don't disagree with you, Sharice, but I also think there was something else. Having been, at the Ferguson protests, at Baltimore protests, I think that there's a bunch of different levels of the dynamics that were happening, right? So the other thing that happens, right, is that everything that was happening as politics gets collapsed as Black Lives Matter. And that happened in two ways, right? That happened from the outside in and the inside out. So organizations that already existed prior to that moment, they allow themselves to be taken under the umbrella of Black Lives Matter because of what Black Lives Matter was doing at the time. And then that allowed the sort of general public to call everything Black Lives Matter. And so I also think that, like, something that we have to work to do in analyzing the history is to disaggregate this shit, because there were a lot of organizations that were doing work that took up that mantle, maybe as a slogan, but weren't necessarily Black Lives Matter organizations, right? So there's something there too. But I think that people
Wait, but just a question, Lila, didn't the organizational structure come on the back end anyway? Because it did start as, and so I'm just wondering what the order of operations is, because it did literally start as just Black Lives Matter, right? And then the infrastructure was built around that.
It was.
And so I wonder what that has, how that figures into like the conflation, which I think is absolutely right. And then the idea like Black Lives Matter as a moment, Black Lives Matter as a movement, and then Black Lives Matter as an organization.
But then because even later on, what then happens in 2015, was that the movement for Black Lives becomes this larger thing that is supposedly this kind of, is actually the organization, right? And not the organization, but it's actually this sort of umbrella structure that comes into place that attempts to acknowledge that other entities existed that took up Black Lives Matter as a mantle, but weren't necessarily Black Lives Matter. But in all that, I think is something that we can talk about in more detail. But in terms of that, wanting a modern day civil rights movement, I mean, I think that language got used and people got swept up in that. But I think we can't ignore that for people 25 and under at that time, that was really their first times ever being involved in direct action campaign and really feeling the momentum of the moment. Like I think that we can both be critical and with historical accuracy and precision, but also remember like what it meant to be like organizing, protesting in between that kind of 2013, 2015, those 2 years, a lot of shit was happening. And Ferguson, like, that was a long sustained, like the longest sustained sort of direct action campaign that we've seen since the apartheid era, and then even before, right? And so there is, I don't know, I think there are many things to consider in that, and I don't think that identity reductionism was the sole thing that contributed to that. And if anything, I think that had to do with narrative fashioning, that people constantly telling that story, that it was the sort of longest sustained political mobilization that we had seen in this country since the civil rights movement, is what created that conflation with that moment.
But the other aspect of identity reductionism is the reduction of the demands to racial demands, right? And the way, and later on, the internationalism, the Palestine solidarity, for example, the class analysis came in. But I think that that's the other aspect of identity reductionism that one might argue was present initially. And also that's also part of the sort of confrontation, is the performativity, right? That the politics is the willingness to confront as opposed to the actual content, which is also part of a sort of identitarian or performative politic.
So yeah, one called Black Lives Matter performs a self-humiliation at Hillary Clinton's hands. This is real simple. I'll make this very quick. So basically, like, there was, I think one of y'all brought it up, that there was a disruption with Hillary Clinton as well. And so he details it. And there was actually a video of the activists talking with Hillary Clinton. And it was an even worse expression of what he says in the first piece, that, they were basically like, Black people have been through all of this trauma and Black people have suffered. And, do you understand? Is your heart in the right place? Like, this is what they were saying. And he talks about Hillary Clinton just gave them a civics lesson, because she's just like, and then she's like, what are your demands? Like, okay, she's like, we can't change hearts, we have to change systems. And he was like, they got schooled. And then he shows Alicia Garza, which he's always more critical of her than he is of Patrice, which I think is an interesting thing to look at as well. But
Patrice didn't really flex till later on. Patrice, I think Patrice kind of short, her ascent was later. I think Opal almost initially was like, she was getting her bag, but like she didn't put herself in the forefront. I think that Patrice was like, she did like a passing late thing later on, so.
And Opal, I think, was always the more internationally focused of the three, because she was doing stuff with
immigration work and stuff.
Yeah.
But yeah, so he quotes Alicia Garza on a MSNBC show, and she's just pretty much they're asking her like, what do y'all want? I do want to see if I can read that, because that was just an interesting way of yes.
This what you're talking about now is literally the image that came to mind, because I remember how trash, because like they standing off to the side of the stage. I remember that whole interaction very distinctly.
Yeah, the Garza wasn't part of the, just to clarify, Garza wasn't she wasn't part of the protesters at the event, but he's showing that his point was to show that the protesters are pulling from their leaders, or their leader in this case. And so an MSNBC host asked what BLM wants presidential candidates to do, and Garza says, first and foremost, acknowledge whether they believe that Black Lives Matter. And we've seen almost all of the major candidates, at least on the Democratic side, saying as much. Now, I'm not going to read the whole quote because, again, there's a lot there. But I think another thing that we have to remember was there became this huge debate about simply just saying Black Lives Matter. And that was the only thing. Like, will you say Black Lives Matter or will you not? And if you say it, you're right, you're not racist. If you don't say it, you're racist. All lives matter. And I know I wasted a lot of time, even myself, arguing with people about that particular thing. And it only became about the term. I've said this on my own show before. Like H. Brown talked about how Black people went from Negro to Black. And he was like one of the major political victories that Black people ever had was being called Black. He was like, white man was like, all right, yeah, I'll concede that. You're Black. And then what? You know, so it's like, well, they say Black Lives Matter. And then what? Like, what do you materially gain from that? So he's making that critique here about if you don't have a worldview, you don't necessarily have anything to really pull from. So you open yourself up to co-optation. So in the last piece, Garza versus McKesson, the great debate over how the Democratic Party will liberate Black people. Now, this is months ahead after the pieces we've been talking about. And as he predicted, they pretty much did become lobbyists, because at this point, they are actually advocating to have a debate amongst Democratic candidates on these issues. And Garza and D-Ray McKesson, who's over Campaign Zero, are debating on what kind of format there should be.
Sweater vest boy.
Yeah.
I think it's the puffy vest. I don't think it's the sweater. I think it's the Aladdin.
It was orange vest. Orange vest is what I meant to say. Orange vest, boy.
So,
great debate.
So Garza gets framed as being the radical in this case versus McKesson. And then Garza is, because Garza is advocating for a harsher form of debate than McKesson, who's literally just working directly with the Democratic Party. And this is also after the Democratic Party has already said that we believe Black Lives Matter, and they put it in their platform. And then Garza and the other two were like, we don't want nothing to do with that. They were like, we don't want to claim that or whatever, even though they were probably meeting behind the scenes. So Melissa Harris Perry compares this to Dr. Martin Luther King and the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party in 1964 and the Democratic Political Convention, and how that was the split. I don't really see the analogy there, but that she compares it to that. And she says Dr. King was probably right in comparison to the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, as far as like, remember, for people who don't know, there was a party that was created by SNCC and other members within the Mississippi to oppose the Democratic Party in Mississippi because they were racist. So they tried to create their own party, and they were rejected at the
White
convention.
Primaries.
Yeah. So Ford says, and then I'll wrap this up. He says, but of course, no one will free us but us. Certainly neither of the two big business parties. There's a whole lot going on these days at Black Lives Matter and Campaign Zero, lots of individual upward mobility, but little of it has anything to do with the people's movement. These two organizations are no longer in the line of that work. Now, he said that in 2015. So in light of that, in light of the recent information, particularly in the New York Magazine about
Black... also said Angela Davis lost her damn mind.
Over Obama, yes. Yeah. And that proved to be fairly correct as well. In light of the recent information, particularly in New York Magazine about Black Lives Matter and Campaign Zero's corruption, how do Ford's words resonate? And then secondly, we already kind of talked about this. The Black radical critique is often dismissed as unrealistic until proven correct. Is it possible to persuade or organize people around these critiques before everything is co-opted?
I'm just reminded of what Layla always says, like, some lessons we don't have to learn. They're already there. Like, they already been done. You know what I'm saying? And I think, but what I will say is that I think that oftentimes Glen Ford or even like Black radicals are an anachronism. And so like they're out of time, right? And so all that we can do is raise the critique so people can't say they didn't know, right? I think that because of I think that that's the function of radicalism in this right-wing settler colonial society, right? Because if it's about winning, right, then it's just demoralizing. But if it's about sort of, and it's not even about being right in like a moralistic sense, it's about what we're doing now, looking back and being like, okay, this critique was there. We don't need to make this mistake again. And at least theoretically, and because we know the way that the US functions as a co-opting body, perhaps these critiques will be taken up moving forward, right? So we don't have to reinvent the wheel. And one might argue that lessons were learned in 2020, right? That these lessons, these critiques, in some ways in organizing were taken up and were internalized, and that created the conditions for what transpired and how 2020 was sustained. So I think that, it's not, I think that in some ways, I feel like Glen knew that, right? He offered up the critique, not to believe Glen Ford, but because it was the right critique. And also so that we have that, right? It's on wax. We have that and we know. And certainly now people are like, now all of a sudden it's like, oh, these people are stealing or doing whatever the fuck they doing. But,
But the question I still have is, are we learning these lessons though? Right. Because I can't remember which chapter it was in, but Glen Ford cites, well, both Castro and Malcolm have their own versions of this, right? History will absolve me, and history, what's the other version of it? History, I can't remember what it is. But so in reference to the first question about how it resonates, I mean, to Sharice's point, we're seeing these things.
These really generic, like anti-racist arguments set us up for a 2020 where everything can just be funneled into a Joe Biden after everyone's in the streets, because there's really not a lot of material basis for it. It's easy to just fill it in. So as you can say that, Black Lives Matter, again, that is a very open door concept. It's not that they don't matter, but my version of Black Lives Matter can be diversity. And then another person's version of Black Lives Matter can be, a white person can date Black people. Like, it's so open door. Like, it doesn't demand anything. That's why I go back to his point about demands. Like, it doesn't demand you to really take any particular line other than just say Black Lives Matter, and whatever that means to you, like, it just is what it is. So the Democratic Party saw that if they just basically owned it, like, yeah, Black Lives Matter, and we're going to be responsive, because a lot of what we wanted, unfortunately, I think, was just somebody to hear us out, somebody to recognize our pain. And that just opens the door for all kinds of co-optation. I think he was just showing that on a mechanical level. Like, when you approach things like that, and when you step into the arena in that way, it's easy to just take it anywhere, because it's really not headed any particular direction. Now, obviously, there were more militant, uprisings, particularly in the streets. But it was easy to just wash all of that away. Like, activists literally got killed in the Ferguson, and nobody was there for them. And then all this money shows up. But I think we get caught up on the money part, but it's the ideology and these ideas that just set it up where that money can go like that. Because, all right, Black Lives Matter, I'm just going to donate, because Black Lives Matter. Like, it all sets it up for the corruption, because there wasn't any real guardrails in place. And I mean, there's a longer eulogy to be had about Black Lives Matter, but I'm just saying, like, I think he gave us some of the ways to just analyze why it did go wrong in many ways. I think he was able to set that up for us pretty early.
So there's a few pieces that I pulled out that I thought we need to discuss. One is the validity and usefulness of the term Black misleadership class that Glen wrote in 2018, January 4th, 2018 to be exact. And this was important for a number of reasons. So this was kind of like a debate with Bruce Dixon, the late Bruce Dixon, RIP, who passed away in 2020. And I think, first of all, this piece is really, really important because it shows what principled struggle looks like. We have to have principled struggle within our organizations. We're going to disagree, And instead of it devolving into, you know, triggers and ad hominem attacks, this is how you struggle, because they remain, you know, they continue to work together. And so I just think it's a very important embodiment of that. But basically, Bruce Dixon has on December 21st of 2017, Bruce Dixon had published an article that said that, where he was sort of like, he thinks the misleadership class is a misnomer. It's not a good sort of political tool, in that essentially what it implies is that they're real Blacks or authentic Blacks. It was more so about the authenticity of Blackness as opposed to a righteous political critique. And this was despite the fact that Dixon had used this term for years. And so Glen was like, hold up, right? So he offered a number of reasons why Black misleadership class was a essential political tool that he was not willing to give up, because of the work that it did to name, like, sort of, especially like intra-racial class dynamics, and the way that a particular class of Black people were sort of carrying water or caping for capital, basically. And so the definition, so he defines the Black misleadership class as Black political forces that emerged at the end of the 1960s, eager to join the corporate and duopoly political, mostly Democrat ranks, and to sell out the interests of the overwhelmingly working class Black masses in the process. It is both an actual and aspirational class, which ultimately sees its interests as tied to those of U.S. imperialism and its ruling circles. It seeks representation in the halls of corporate power and dreads social transformation, which will upset the class's carefully cultivated relationship with power. And so part of the reason why Bruce Dixon was saying that this was not a good term was because most people did not belong to the political class. And what Glen was pointing out was that Bruce Dixon was narrowing what the political meant by having that particular definition of who belongs to the political class. Because for Glen, it was like academics, it was generally people who had influence, not necessarily just the people who were senators or mayors or whatever, right? And so so Dixon was saying that because the political class was so small, that misleadership class was sloppy and imprecise. And so that's basically what, you know, the article is about. But I think that one of the most important things that Glen said for me was that, you know, misleadership class is a political weapon that we need to have to rebuke and isolate our internal enemies, right? And then that reminded me of the quote from Kwame Ture, when he says that we have to be ruthless with the class struggle, right? Africans have to be ruthless with the class struggle. And I think that that's what Glen was saying as well. And so sort of a discussion question for this piece is sort of, what does Black misleadership class illuminate for us in terms of intra-racial class struggle? And then was Dixon right in terms of that it can obfuscate particular dynamics? And if so, what are those?
I mean, I think anything runs the risk of being obfuscated when it's misinterpreted. So there's no like emphatic, he's absolutely wrong, that it can be misused and misunderstood, as any of these terms can be. But I think that classification is important, and the broader understanding of it is important too, right? Even school teachers, right? Even people who we think about as largely the work is undervalued, they're overworked, they're taxed. But when we have school teachers who are, perhaps because of their own fears of losing their job, and perhaps because of their own patriotism, do not respect when certain students articulate their desire not to say a Pledge of Allegiance, and they are creating a classroom environment whereby they are creating American patriots who learn how to be proper consumers. They are a critical step, they are a critical member of that Black misleadership class. And I do think it's important to understand them in that way, no matter what their position is, because they are people who, by virtue of whatever it is they do out in the world, that have a particular influence and impact on other people, and they are continuing to spread misinformation. And so much of our battles become not just battles against our, as you said, external enemies, but they become battles with the enemies within, because we got to figure out, how do we even get on the same page to know that we have a shared enemy to fight? If we don't even see the value in some of these, smaller things. Like I remember very distinctly as a 9-year-old, my parents told me that I didn't have to say the Pledge of Allegiance. And I remember going back and forth with my teacher. And I remember her saying to me, I'm gonna call your parents. I was like, please do. They the ones who told me not to say this shit. I don't understand what you think what you're threatening me with here. Like, my daddy is definitely coming in here to my defense. But I think it's important to think about all of those different levels, from a Barack Obama to a Miss Johnson, your kid's third grade teacher, right? And so, I mean, and in my case, that particular teacher was not Black, but there were plenty of Black teachers that were like that, right? And so I think it's very useful term for illuminating these sort of intraracial class struggles. And I think there's other, we have the terms indigenous collaborators. Like there are all these other ways that this group has been theorized over time. And I think it would take a little bit more work to think about what one specific kind of nomenclature or characterization does for us that the other one doesn't. But I think they're all describing the same phenomena. And I think it's important that we know that it exists, and we know that it's something worth fighting.
Yeah, I think I found that piece just good, like you said at the beginning, just to see that they could have a principle back and forth. And Ford still wrote it like he was talking about anybody else. Like, he still took his shots. He still said it like he wasn't nicer about it than he was with anyone else. That part was funny. And like you said, they still work together.
He's a battle rapper. He's like, yeah. Period. Like, it's shots, period.
Yeah. So yeah, that was gonna happen. But as far as the class goes, I mean, I think I still like the term, because I think it particularly the misleadership part of it, because it just, like I was talking about earlier with my issues with when people say pro-Black, it's pro-Black literally, and anymore it can just mean you're Black and you're just not a flat out coon in the most explicit way, like you're not a Clarence Thomas or something. And then anything else rides. But I'm always like, it's okay to just say that some Black people suck, like just even individually, like it's okay to just say that some Black people are just not good. So it doesn't have to be about an authentic Blackness. It can say Blackness has the ability to be terrible and be radical and revolutionary. It can be all those. It can be any of those things. It doesn't have an inherent position that it has to take. And I think when you assume that Blackness does have that, and then people are failing to live up to this inherent radical Blackness, and not Sharice's radical, like, but I'm saying just a sense of like Blackness is just radical inherently, like, and people just assume that, and it's just not, what I'm saying? So it's like, by calling it misleadership class, you're able to show the function of that class and how they often serve to push you towards a more reactionary expressions of Blackness, because it can be political in any sense, right? So it doesn't have like one direction that it has to take, but to maintain this system, it often is misleadership.
I think what's important about calling it a class too is that it's not just individuals. That this is a collective way of moving. This is a particular relationship to capital. It's a particular relationship within the context of U.S. society, and it's a reflection of the dependent nature of Black class formation, right? Because it has to do with the way that these folks serve a managerial function for capital, right? And a management function to undermine, co-opt, water down, or straight up discipline the Black masses, right? And so calling it's a class politics, it's a class politics, it's a class orientation, it's a class commitment that it's important that it's sort of endemic in Blackness, right? Or the Black community as a category because of the way that we are positioned in society. But then it's not just reducible to race. It has to do with a particular economic political economic commitment, right? And I think that that's why it's important as well.
I also think that the question on authenticity is often weird, right? Because people think about authenticity as an individual thing, like you're authentic to your individual self. But if you think about authenticity to a group of people, right? Black authenticity is not about Layla's authenticity or Sharice's authenticity. It's not about any of us as individuals. It is about, okay, what types of decisions are made that are for the collective good of whatever that group of people is, right? And in that way, you know, part of what people were trying to articulate in the late 90s, early 2000s with the 1% was that even in terms of authenticity around whatever happens for white folks, these decisions that were being made were still not necessarily materially benefiting the masses of white people, even though they were still sort of buying into the lie of that, right? And so this idea about an authentic Black leader, to, you know, much to whatever, you know, Bruce's issue was with the nomenclature of Black misleadership class, it has to do with people who are in power, whatever kind of power they are, making decisions or making choices that are for the benefit of the masses of people, whatever they represent. For us, for Black people, right? And so if we are, you know, cutting backdoor deals and making decisions that individually enrich us or our families, but still to the detriment of the vast majority of our community, there is something there that I think is to be questioned about authenticity, right? And who are you actually identifying with? And that's not to say that you're somehow not Black, but that the decisions that you are making, the moves that you're making in the world are not considering the well-being of the masses of this group of people. And I think that distinction has to be made clear too.
So I think that, so I have a related, but I think slightly sort of different point about why this is not about politics of authenticity, because the managerial function of that class is authentically Black. It has to do with Black class formation. And so this is why Glen is talking about political commitment. He is talking about relationship to the mode of production. He's not talking about authenticity in any sort of cultural or ontological or racial sense, right? So Bruce, I don't know if Bruce has seen the word authentic in something that Glen had wrote, but it's like, that is not what Glen is arguing at all, right? That, because to me, I read Glen to say that there is something sort of endogenous to the class. Antagonism is endogenous in Blackness. And this is why we need to be relentless with the class struggle. And this is why we need to point out the misleadership class, because it's something that is normal. It's something that it has always been, and it will continue to be so unless we point it out. And as he said, we isolate those people, right? We shame and isolate those people, basically. So,
we all know you love a good public shaming.
I love a good dragon. I live like that lady in Derek Bell's and his work, where she said, I live to harass white folks. I live for a good dragon, period. Okay, so the next piece is called Fear Pervades Politics and Makes Us Agents of Our Own Oppression. And this is from March 4th, 2020. And Glen is writing in the context right after Super Tuesday. And so he's dragging the Blacks, the Black misleadership class, because he says that they convey a corrosive fear and abject terror over the thought of, quote, their Democratic Party being fractured by Bernie Sanders and his followers. And so they shored up support for Biden in South Carolina on Super Tuesday, led by Clyburn, right? And what he points out that's really important is that these folks are not only afraid of Trump, they are afraid of the left, right? That the Blacks are operating as a sort of anti-left flank in the Democratic Party. And so, and the other thing he says is that this group, the Black Democrats, equate what's good for the Democrats as what's good for Black folks or with Black interests, even though these are deeply antithetical given the nature of the duopoly. He then goes on to pull out and analyze the Bloomberg candidacy, which I think is really, really important, because he says that Bloomberg didn't expect to win at all. He just had the dough to kind of come in, and then to Glen says, quote, progressive proof the Democratic Party and make it hostile to any semblance of leftism. And then I just got to read this dragging Glen offers up for the Blacks that supported Bloomberg. So he said, the allure of Bloomberg's gold has exposed the cockroaches of the Black misleadership class, hordes of whom scurried across the linoleum to enlist as mercenaries of obscene capital. Okay. He said, this is the undiluted essence of Black Democratic, quote, strategic politics. 4 members of the Congressional Black Caucus, Meeks of New York, Mithbath of Georgia, Plaskett of Virginia, and Rush of Illinois, plus the despicable former Tennessee Congressman Harold Ford, and the Black mayors of Little Rock, Arkansas, Compton, California, San Francisco, California, Stockton, California, Charlotte, North Carolina, Columbia, South Carolina, Houston, Texas, and Washington, D.C., plus former mayors of Columbus, Ohio, New York City, Baltimore, Maryland, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and Flint, Michigan, hoard for Bloomberg and can be expected to be at his and other oligarchs' service for the duration of the party's battles with leftish interlopers. I'm just gonna leave it there. That's just the mic drop. And so the conversation to have. So my question was this, right? So Ford wrote that the Black misleadership class eagerly offered themselves as co-managers of oppression for a small cut of the spoils and privileges of racial leadership. So I wondered if this could be understood as a blackface variation of what Du Bois and Lenin formulated as a labor aristocracy, where basically, you know, the working class aligns with capital against sort of racialized workers or colonized workers to get a little bit of the booty, right? So I wondered if the booty. So I wonder, like, what y'all thought about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's, I mean, at least as upon my initial reflection, I think that has some meat to it. Because I mean, even when you look at the actual numbers, it's a particular class of Black people in the Democratic Party, and it's also, in essence, it's very generational. You're talking about a particular age group of Black people, because those are the ones that they say vote the most. So very particular, like in South Carolina, just in this last election, that's when it swung for Biden, because he was getting his ass kicked up to that point. And they say, and what they always say, Black voters saved him. And they assume that it's the entire Black community that did it, not what is pretty much a conservative state anyway, in South Carolina. And then as Ford has always noted, there's the fear of the white man's parties and the Republican Party. So a lot of times Black people are just voting out of fear of that. But it's this particular class, when you looked at the numbers for people around our age or even a little younger, they were split on Bernie or Biden. It wasn't as particular. And I'm not saying Bernie was the solution either, but I'm saying at least there was a larger political imagination beyond just the typical, Biden, 90s Democratic politics or whatever. But they become the placeholder for the entire group.
Just point out real quick for the record. Kamala's goofy ass was nowhere up in that race.
Nah.
Nowhere to be found. And yes, somehow she became the vice president. I just wanted to remind people her goofy ass was not in the top of that.
I don't even think she even made it to a point where they could take votes. But I'm saying,
but that's why she epitomizes the Black misleadership class, because she didn't even bring no shit to the table.
We don't even like you. You don't even go here. And yet there you are.
You don't even go here. Seats taken.
But now they become the placeholder, and everything is understood through that group. I mean, we talked about elite capture last week, but everything is understood through, a narrow baby boomer, Black church, conservative going group. And then that becomes representative of Black people. And then the narrative becomes that Black people were actually to the right of the party. That's what the media narrative is, that they're more moderate voters. But when you looked at the numbers, when they crunched it, that they did find, particularly the Black women were some of the most moderate voters as far as their views on things compared to some of the white leftists, which again, if we're not talking about class, that might be confusing. That may not make sense to people. How does that play out? But if we put class into the mix, so you can think about it as a labor aristocracy, at least in that mode, then it starts to make sense how that group structures the interests of everyone else, and often sells us out.
Yeah, to be honest, I don't even know what to add to that, because I think that's it. You laid out the case very clearly, and we can keep going in on them. But yes, I absolutely agree with that reading.
So one other caveat that relates to the point that Two Black made about the perception that Black people are actually to the right. What Glenn points out is that Black people are actually to the left in the Democratic Party, to the left of every other racial group. Not least because even, like I've said previously, even the Tommiest of Toms tend to be against white supremacy, right? They tend to be against at least racism, right? Their solutions can be ass backwards, but like, I think on that point alone. But so then the question is, if it is, as Glenn says, that Blacks are to the left of other races in the Democratic Party, why do they too feel the need to punch left?
Why does the Democratic Party need to punch left, or Blacks need to punch
the
left?
Blacks? Like
when we say Blacks, when we say Blacks, because I think we're all making the same point about the labor aristocracy. Are we saying Black people, or are we saying that class punches left?
The establishment. So these establishment Democrats who are, the party is their home, and they, you know, why do they feel the need to punch left? If
because they're trying to hold on to the, because they're trying to hold on to their class position. I mean, like that's literally what it is. That you it's Chicken George. You gotta show Master that you can take care of these Negroes, that you can keep them in line, right? Because you want to protect your position. I mean, we constantly see that. I mean, and that is precisely the reason why they're dangerous as a Black misleadership class, because they're literally, their job is to oversee, to corral, to continue to, they become the line, they become the marker by which we understand this is where you're supposed to be, and if you're not here, you're a problem, right? And you are something to be dealt with otherwise. But that constant need to be able to say, you know, I am where I'm supposed to be, and so you, the white leadership class, needs to continue to come to me because I can be trusted with the goal, the objective, which is to keep the rest of these Negroes in line.
I mean, they heard the sheep. They heard the sheep. So that I mean, that's and they don't, when they punch left, they're not just punching left at white folks. They punch left even at Black folks. Even if some Black people may not even put it in that language that we're coming from the left, if we just ask for something, you know, besides just symbolism, they even punch left on that, right? So I'm saying, like, they don't want to share. Like, these niggas don't want to share. Like, that's the only thing that was going through my mind when we were talking. Like, they just don't want to share. So I'm saying, like, anything that moves it to the left, like even you know, I guess rest in peace, but John Lewis was like, you know, when Bernie was talking about you know, Medicare for all, and you know, or even Clyburn, like, you know, well, all that free stuff, you know, we don't want handouts, or, you know, that's not realistic.
Yes, we do. Yeah. Shit, run it. So, run it. We pay taxes for this shit. What you talking about?
But they come out and do that. And then remember Clyburn was on, and he said he was in conversation with John Lewis, and everybody likes to invoke John Lewis. But again, that's another episode of how John Lewis as SNCC member versus congressman is a lot different. You know, so it's like, but he talked about, you know,
you know, they say your heroes shouldn't get old. They'll live long enough to disappoint you.
Yeah.
Except Du Bois. That's why I rock with Du Bois, because he did it right. He got old and radical.
Yeah, that was he went the opposite way of most. But like, you know, but I'm saying, like, they will tell you these things are realistic. And then some people will come out and make arguments that I think might have, I don't know if we have enough time to get into this, might have some credence as far as, like, I don't agree, but I think it's worth engaging. Like, I remember there was a piece in The Root, not my favorite place, and they were basically arguing, I think it was Michael Harriot was arguing that that Black people don't believe that white folks are going to share. Therefore, we don't want to go as left because we don't believe in these universal programs. So we're going to vote for the more pragmatic candidate because we understand them. It's almost to say, you know the evil that you're already dealing with. You don't trust any new kind of evil, right? So you're just going to allow, because you don't think white people are going to share. Like, white people don't want to distribute wealth because whiteness, you know, it's this kind of Afro-pessimist argument. Like, white people don't want to do anything because of whiteness. So we don't really trust the Bernie Sanders. We don't think he's going to come through. We don't think that argument, even beyond a Bernie Sanders, even left of that, is going to work. So we're going to just vote for what we already know. And so you have people making that case too. that Black people are more left in theory, but we don't trust it because of white people. And it just gets reduced to race. And again, I think there's something there, but I'm just throwing out some of the ways in which that gets obfuscated, or they obfuscate like the Black people's ability to go left is these always very race central arguments.
But then you vote for white ass Biden. If white people, so if white socialists aren't going to share, okay, maybe white neoliberals definitely ain't sharing shit, and they're not only not going to share, they're going to take your shit. So that's goofy. Try again, Mike. Anyway, to the last piece, we're moving now towards the Glen sort of internationalist analysis, and the piece, The Shrinking American Empire, which he wrote in 2009. He was writing about how U.S. aggression toward Iraq and the invasion of March 2003 shouldn't be narrowly interpreted as, about just oil or just Israel or just Iran, but rather it should be understood as the aim of imperialism to dominate the planet and to set the terms of every form of human relation. So he's saying that imperialism is just meant to dominate just how humans relate to one another. And that's what the US was on. And it manifested in a number of ways. So it shouldn't just be reduced to one single issue. In 2003, Ford had argued that the Iraq war was aimed at beating back the euro and positioning the US as its own sort of OPEC by controlling oil sources throughout the world. And so in part, the war was a way to defend the dollar. The US, basically what he's saying is that the US is not only trying to dominate, sort of colonize and racialize people, but also Europe, right? Also the euro. And so he goes on to talk, he basically is arguing that the US is hoisted on its own petard of global overreach after, the Iraq war is launched, because instead of sort of consolidating US leadership, the rest of the world was seeking a break with their oppressive ties to US empire. And thus the Iraq war accelerated US imperial decline. So he goes on to say that, quote, when the dollar is dethroned, only the military aspect of the imperial husk will remain, end quote. And so again, yes, Glen, like, come on, Glen, like you narrated exactly where we are today. And it's interesting because Tony Bogues has a book called Heretics and Prophets. And there's so much that's prophetic about Glen Ford's analysis and so much that's like heretical, right? But it's really not prophet in the abstract sense. Again, and when you have a historical materialist analysis, when you're an internationalist and you understand history, it's easy to make these predictions, but so much of the journalists and so many academics are like actually ignorant or so myopic or narrow that they don't have this type of analysis. But I guess the other thing to say is, let me see. Okay, so the question that comes out of this is like looking at the historical trends. Trade war often precedes like world war. So thinking with Glen's analysis of crumbling US empire way back in 2009, there's the recent passage of the Xenophobic America Competes Act, which just passed the House Friday, coupled with anti-Russia aggression in Ukraine. Does that portend like World War III? Like what do y'all think? So we're really just thinking with Glen here, but what do y'all think?
So I have a question about who would you imagine would be the major players of World War III, right? Because none of the world wars were world wars, right? And I say that to say the entire world was not. They were European wars for the most part.
But the entire world was conscripted because of the nature of colonialism and imperialism, which made them world wars. Yeah.
Yes, and so then my question is actually like, who do you think would be? So we obviously Russia, China, the US. Who else do you think would be not conscripted, but who else would be active players in that war? I'm just curious.
I think that those would be the main three, and then the rest of the world will squad up. Like I don't think, because I just don't see. What wars have been launched by folks in the global South of their own volition that weren't defensive wars, that weren't anti-colonial wars? So I think, and I think maybe some people will be sort of Switzerland, they might be non-aligned and be like, we ain't doing this shit. But the problem is that because of the strategic war resources that are in the African continent, it's going to be very, very difficult for people to do that, not least because and there's also AFRICOM, SOUTHCOM, EURACOM, and the US sort of 800 bases around the world. So it will be very difficult for people to have stayed. What'd you
Say
say?
it again.
I said NATO.
NATO, yeah, but NATO's already kind of fracturing, and so that's why Biden is meeting with Germany today, because they're like, Russians never called us nigga. No, they're like, just kidding, but like they're not, they're reluctant. They like, we'll send some helmets, but you know what I mean.
No,
and so
I think it's interesting to think about because Africa would actually be really interesting in the interplay of all this. In particular, thinking about AFRICOM and all of China's recent investments on the continent, like
and in Latin America.
Yes, and so in an interesting way, it's even possible that World War III actually might take place on the continent because of those things, because it becomes this ground, because the US is not accustomed to dealing with war on its own turf. It just ain't the thing that it's accustomed to doing. So it's always trying to fight it somewhere else. And China just got a fucking billion people. So it's just the thing. And so then even in thinking about World War III, even without Africa being a major player in terms of these sort of the overarching interests, it becomes an interesting place to think about where a World War III might actually materially play out and take place. And then thinking again about the way that we continue to suffer from these imperial wars, right? Both in a sort of historical material sense, but then in this moment, like, you motherfuckers don't even have a decency to fight your shit out on your own territory, and so now you use these command stations and these other business projects that you've created to extract resources. And now, on top of the 2-decade-long genocidal wars raging in the Congo, now we got to deal with this other shit between y'all two. So I mean, these are just things that come to my mind when I think about what does World War III look like, where is it happening, who are the major players, who are the parties, and then who are those of us who continue to suffer the fallout.
Well, it would definitely be launched in Eurasia for sure, because part of what the US is trying to do is like recapture particular types of trade routes and to decimate like their economy. So it absolutely be launched there. I think the US would drop an atomic bomb again. Like, you know what I mean? I think that, and also because of drone war, and now one might be dropped in New York, who knows? Because US ain't the only game in town. I think there's 12 nations that have atomic weaponry. Then there's drone warfare. And so I think that initially the US, the theater would be Eurasia, but then, then they game recognize game. So they're not just, they have the tools and the resources to be like, okay. I think that the other thing too, the difficulty about dropping the atomic bomb is that China's the manufacturing center and we owe them like 20 trillion. So it's like, it's also kind of like, that and global, like globalization, right? The economies are so intertwined that, and these motherfuckers claim they care about the supply chain. Well, war is going to disrupt the supply chain. So, I don't know. So it's just,
well, that's the argument of globalization.
Glen is hinting at.
I was saying the argument of globalization, I don't necessarily agree with, is that because the chains are so tied together, the supply chains and the economies, that it will lessen that type of aggression. I don't think we've seen that proven, but that it would lessen that type of aggression because everyone is so intertwined that they can't afford to blow it all up because there'll be a domino effect. But again, I don't think that that's actually proven correct.
But that's also assuming the persistence of dollar hegemony. But as Glenn says, when the dollar stops becoming dominant, only the military husk remains. And the US is like a petulant child that if they like, it's like, I'm going home and I'm taking my ball. And here taking my ball means everybody gotta go. If we can't lead, everybody gotta go. So
yeah, and I think you were probably right on that one. Like that would ultimately be how this ended if it got to that point.
Yeah. So on that high note, Layla.
Okay, so my two pieces. Okay, so the first one that I chose was from November 2016. So this is right on the heels of Trump's presidency. This one was titled "None of Them Has Ever Been My President." And this one kind of stuck out to me because I remember around the same time I wrote a piece similarly titled. It was Trump, this ain't nothing new. And so one of the things that Glen Ford is attempting to do here is to both think about he's continuing his critique of Obama, right? But he's also like pushing back against this, at that time, the people who were so-called to the left of center, not left, but to the left of center, were, crying fascism about Trump and, why they were so afraid of him coming to power. And Glen Ford is basically like, what? These motherfuckers is all the same, right? All of them. Whatever fascism Trump promises has already been in the makings, right? And so he opens up that article citing what was then a newly formed Black is Back Coalition for Social Justice, Peace, and Reparations, saying that, quote, Black and brown people continue to suffer the brunt of and underemployment and predatory loan scandal crises. Military spending under Obama has increased, as has the warfare this nation continues to export to Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Venezuela, and Colombia. Mass incarceration, police brutality, and political imprisonment remain rampant. He then goes on to talk about the particular role that Obama, as the sort of face par excellence of the Black misleadership class, engaged in continuing the role of imperial domination on the continent of Africa, which he explains happened through NATO forces and the jihadist proxies to destroy Libya, to expand AFRICOM. And one of the things that Margaret Kimberly notes it was the foreword to the text was that the Black Agenda Report was one of the few places that constantly reported on AFRICOM, right? And the way that AFRICOM was growing. And so, that's, I think, something that's really important and critical to the legacy of Glen's legacy and the Black Agenda Report's legacy is understanding these kind of the insidious subterfuge, right, of the way that these imperial legacies continue. He talked about Obama's role with the CIA collusion, the CIA's collusion with the African Union in Somalia, and the unrelenting support for over 20 years that was promoting the genocide in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. As I've already said, he says that there's not a dime's worth of difference between Obama, Clinton, and then, we'll add Trump and or Biden, except the fact that Obama's black face of imperialism made it a little bit easier to stomach on the domestic front and somewhat of a Trojan horse, I think, on the international front. Because, it wasn't just people in the US that were falling for, the promise of Obama, right? Obama, they knew what they were doing by putting Obama there. It wasn't just about the US population. It was also about how do we utilize, and this is interesting, sorry, this is an aside, but it makes me think about the Cold War era diplomacy, right? And what was happening with the Jazz Ambassadors tours. And that the rest of the world was really critiquing the US at that time, because it's like, how you gonna try to, come in here on your moral high horse when you got all these problems with lynching, all this other stuff. And so they utilize, Black jazz artists in the era of the Cold War to be able to smooth this shit up. Play like Obama. They were attempting to use his black man, his black face, to come in and say, I'm a friendly face. We can make these deals. We can make shit work. And obviously Trojan horse. But one of the things that the two sort of final things that I want to highlight from that text, he talks about, Glen Ford says that, quote, for those who fear Trump's fascism, the threat level depends on how he uses the arsenal of repressive tools bequeathed to him by the Obama administration. These legal, infrastructural, and technological instruments of the national security state are fascist in their intent. They were made for the purposes of tracking, disorganizing, neutralizing, and locking up dissidents and disinforming the public at large. Finally, he says that the Black movement against police terror didn't need a Donald Trump waiting in the vestibule of the White House to get mad. The movement had already crossed the Rubicon of confrontation with the state. The movement occurred in the second term of the first Black president, when a new generation learned that liberation cannot be vicariously experienced. The 21st century Black movement emerged with the knowledge that Black corporate Democrats are not allies, nor are Black police chiefs, preachers whose real loyalties are to the Democratic Party and its Wall Street patrons. So the question that I have from this, and we've talked about this already to an extent, is, Have we actually collectively learned this lesson that liberation cannot be vicariously experienced? And then let's say if we did, we certainly had a case of amnesia when it came to Biden and Kamala's presidency when they were running. And lastly, what does the daily work of divesting from these forms of politics look like? How do we respond to earnest concerns about our material disadvantages in our attempts to build new futures?
So this to me, like, is the perpetual question about, should we engage electoral politics or not? I am of the belief that we do not need the state to build the economic and to control our communities, but we do need a modicum of state power to defend it. Because if we look at history, lynchings wasn't about these white women. It was about anytime Black people became too prosperous, too powerful, too confrontational, but especially too sort of economically independent or economically sort of started to corner any market. Lynching is very closely tied to this. So in the Red Record and in her other writings, Ida B. Wells, writes about this. And so this is the question, like, how do you defend it, right? But even if Black people were at every sort of echelon of power, the state, which is constituted by capital and particularly white people, the few billionaires notwithstanding, they just have the monopoly on force. And so I think we have to get sort of real about, and I think that your point that you raised earlier about getting involved in localized politics is important. But I think we need to just come to terms with the almost wholly representational function that other national electoral politics serve. It's gonna take, it takes organizing. It takes organizing our own communities to be able to account for what our economic well-being will be. And so oftentimes this vote or die shit, this cha-cha slide, to submit your vote, that is a deterrent, and that's a sort of it's a red herring in particular ways, right? And so I think that we really, really need to be conscious of that.
I think going back to the question of Black misleadership class and how Ford was saying how it can't be narrowly defined just by politicians. So I feel like, the Black leadership class obviously is broader than that. It's celebrity, it's, like you said, even down to the school teacher. So it's like, have we collectively learned? I think it depends on like for certain parts of the Black misleadership class, I think we have grown a little more skeptical of. So I don't think we're as trustful, even though the Kamala thing did happen. More people weren't really rocking with that as they were with Obama. Like, that wasn't nearly as gross as it was with Obama for those of us who lived through it. But the celebrity part, but no, I think the political class, I think people are more skeptical of because they've just been so openly terrible for the last few years that I think even Black people aren't as moved by like Black politicians or Black cops or whatever. It doesn't mean we still can't be susceptible to it. You see what's happening with, Eric Adams in New York or whatever. But I'm just saying, like, I don't think it's explicit, but other forms of leadership, the celebrity who claims to be apolitical in some cases, who kind of can get outside of that and say they're an outsider and say, I feel you that all of this isn't working. I don't think we've learned that lesson at all. I think that's actually gotten worse. Obama, in a weird way, Obama was more of almost a celebrity than he was a politician. And I think that he kind of helped usher that in. Remember, he won the whole marketing campaign.
Yeah, that's why he made Trump possible too.
Yeah,
because we was ready for a celebrity.
But I think the celebrity thing has just exploded in ways that I don't even think we saw coming. I mean, we've always had that conflict, but I think it's to a point where, no, I don't think we've learned, because I've seen people who have politics all over the place of whatever, but when they're appointed celebrity, and again, celebrity can be an activist, it can be a politician, it can be, but they experience it through celebrity, no matter the position. When that celebrity is under attack, all shit goes out the door. If you were one of those people who were Patrice Cullors, like, head, then when she had all those houses, you're like, well, why do activists gotta be broke? Like all of a sudden, those politics go out the door. You were a socialist one day, and you just see that with everybody. Like, so I'm saying the celebrity thing, I think I don't think we've learned that. I think on is a very narrow like electoral politics, I think we've learned some things, but overall, no.
Not a Patrice Culler's head. I'm sorry. But just quickly, all I want to add to that is like, it's the confluence of celebrity culture and influencerism. Influencerism really, really took off at the tip in the Obama moment, I think, or maybe slightly before, but like influencer as like a way to make a living, that's new. That's different.
Yeah, but that's because like YouTube only became a thing in 2005. So that's
But it was like a particular apex or rise of YouTube, right? That started literally creating a new like they're basically micro celebrities. Some of them are actually macro celebrities now, but like, you know what I mean? That so it's the influencerism combined with the celebrity culture, and then the sort of stan culture where the sort of and Jared Ball, his critique of like Diddy and bringing like haterade and hating as a way to like mollify critique, I think is really important as well, because any critique becomes hating in the context of this influencer grind
all of us
culture,
can have stan accounts.
Shut up. But not all of us can have hives either. So what is your point?
No, but what I was the other point that I was gonna make, which is to both of you all, like I think it's important to Black to acknowledge where we have made incremental success, right? And I think sometimes it's easy to not do that because you're like, damn, like why are we still here? But I do think that it is probably objectively true that there was more room for a variety of reasons for a critique of Kamala and to not just accept her because she was Black following trailing the legacy of Obama. So I mean, I will acknowledge that. I still think we ain't learned that lesson the way we needed to, but absolutely. And I think to the point that you made, Sharice, about even the local politics, I think that this is a moment where we have to understand why it's important to both think local and supranational, right? Because I think, and this will come up even in the next piece, when we think about Black folks as 12, 13, 14% of the US population, we're a small minority in the country context, but the things that we're fighting for, the issues, the battles that are being waged on so many different planes. And I think and that's what's important about being aware of all of the different places where we can actually find those commonalities and struggles, and to know that like this ain't the only battlefront. And I think to know that this is not the only battlefront makes it not easy, but easier when we do lose battles, to know that the war is still being waged, right? Even when there's, smaller things that are happening here. And so I think that there's something that local politics does that helps us maintain our humanity, right? Like basic shit. Like, we need to be able to eat, and we need to be able to go to the doctor, and we need to be able to have some basic things that allow us, human decency. And that we need to understand how people are struggling for those things everywhere. And that's I think the fundamental flaw of only understanding politics at the national level in the US, because there's just so much else happening in the world, and that the US is very much a part of, right? And so that's why I think it's important for us to, like one of the things that I think was coming up a lot when Hillary and Joe Biden were running is that people were, I think, confused about some of the promises that remain yet unfulfilled. Some of the promises that might have made some things on the domestic front a little bit easier, like maybe student loan debt cancellation, which didn't happen, or, whatever jobs promises, limited promises might have happened. But then when we see that the imperial agenda remains the same, then we have to continue to know what those connections are, and know that like there's no sincere commitment to a humane life for any of us. They need to continue to maintain a class of people to oppress and exploit. And they will do so nationally and internationally. And then that's what I think we have to keep our eye on. Okay, so the final piece is the Black and Latino Future, Finding a Way to Solidarity, which was written this is one of the older pieces, I think, of all the ones that we've covered. This was in 2006, so this even predates Obama. Hold up, y'all, I just lost my place, Lord.
Probably Black commentator too.
Say it again.
This piece.
Well, I think it was right when Black Agenda Report was just launched, because it's October. So I would imagine that this is like one of the first pieces.
Okay, so this piece I thought was an important one to highlight because it speaks to a lot of things that I'm personally interested in and the kind of research that I've done over the years. And so Glen starts this piece out with two interesting cases, right? So he starts off with the quote: among some Black circles, the mass Latino political actions were met with a sullenness, often deeply tinged with envy and outright hostility, drenched in vicious vitriol and willful ignorance. So what he's, trying to get at in this piece is the way that Black people in the US can sometimes, often, take issue with all Latinos, and he even talks about the sort of conflation of what are undocumented immigrants and people who have sort of gone through the sort of legal immigration process, and also even the notion that the stand-in for immigrants is Latinos, when obviously the country is made up of a number of different immigrants, and we don't have the same feelings about all of the immigrants that come to the U.S. But he highlights two cases, one of which is Claude Anderson blaming African-American economic slippages on the influx of immigrants at the time, particularly Latino immigrants. And then this woman, Mary Mitchell's criticism of this Latino woman, Elvira Arellano, who was seeking sanctuary that same year in Chicago. She was an undocumented immigrant who had been there for a little while. And her case became one of these sort of emblematic cases looking for that created this sort of sanctuary movement. So what's really interesting here is that in his typical Glen fashion, he actually goes in on Black folks again. He says, Blacks have been conditioned to be much more Anglo in their perceptions of Latino assertiveness than most of us are willing to admit. Having been raised under the same Black-white paradigm as Euro-Americans, we often share with most whites a profound ignorance, not only of global historical and social realities, but of the conditions that have shaped the societies of our Latin American neighbors. And what stands out for me here is that, okay, so one of the things I think is really important about understanding the nature of the dynamics between Blacks and Latinos in the US is that, one, there's often a way that race is obscured in the category of Latino, period. And so, we have to think about the fact that, Black folks in the US make up less than 13% of the population, 41 million people. Those people who are identified or self-identified as Latino on the census are about 19 million at this point, so 62 million. So the population is already larger. But the thing about that Latino population is that Latino population is made up of a number of different racial categories, right? Latino is not a racial category. And so it's actually really misleading that these categories even coexist on the census, because they don't demarcate the same social phenomena. But historically, what's also, I think, important to know is that less than 6% of all enslaved Africans came to British North America. And so if we think about what it means to be Black in the US, as with such a small historical population and a relatively small contemporary percentage of the population, we have to take more seriously what it means to be Black throughout the rest of the Americas, because over 90% of enslaved Africans went to the Caribbean and Latin America. And that even now, like in a place like Brazil, now the problem with these numbers again on the census is that depending on who was asked, how it was calculated, they can be debated in all different types of ways. But we know that over half of Brazil's population is considered to be of some African descent, discernible African descent. And that's 97 million people, right? That's already more than the Black population in sheer numbers, not percentage, than it is in the US. And those numbers are similar in places like the Dominican Republic, Cuba, Puerto Rico, Colombia, Venezuela, and even in other countries throughout Latin America. And so I just wanted to offer those statistics for context. But then Glen also says, there will be no living wage for anyone if corrupt African-American politicians insist on making common cause with oppressive employers like Walmart, all the while subscribing to the canard that Latino immigrants want to work for substandard wages. And so here he's referencing a particular case where overwhelmingly Latinos were in support of a living wage, and that the particular configuration of Black people who were voting to support or deny this living wage, Black folks were split. Right. And so part of what he's doing here is to contest this idea that we have about Latino immigrants, that they're all willing to just come here and work for pennies as unskilled laborers and don't give a shit and they're taking our jobs. Right. So he's trying to dispel this notion. And that finally, for the sake of our common interest, Black progressives are obligated to do everything possible to cleanse the African-American dialogue of parochialism, insults against ethnicities, useless nostalgia that keeps us fixed in a past time, and most importantly, the nativism inherited from our historical oppressors. So a part of what he's doing is say, yo, like it is a fundamental mistake for us to make, to replicate the same types of racist, historical, problematic vitriol that white folks have in trying to fight for our own freedom, right? So the questions that I have is, how can we be attentive to and combat the complicated ways that the categories of whiteness constantly expands to make room for those once deemed non-white? Because I think some of the fear about the way Latinos exist is that even as they are targeted as immigrants, even as they're poor, maybe working in unskilled labor, that we know that the way the category of whiteness works to expand, there's room made for them, those of them who are not easily identifiable and discernible as Black folks. So how can we be attentive to and combat these kind of complicated ways that the category expands, and heed Ford's warning or his admonition about our often anglicized understandings of racial dynamics in order to understand the common nature of our struggle as Black and Latino peoples and the common nature of our enemies, which are capitalism, imperialism, and in our case as Black people in the US, as domestic police and the immigration enforcement for undocumented and documented immigrants.
Well, I think so. This is interesting, right? Because again, Ford's analysis, I think that the sort of FBA and ADOS shit, and so drag me shit, I don't care. That is a precise.
You beat me to it. I was literally gonna say,
yeah.
What you're saying is he predicted ADOS before they started, but you beat me to it. Go ahead.
Yep. And that's the exact sort of thing that he is analyzing. And then I think that the other thing that it does is oftentimes we talk about, CIA, that they're CIA funded, but what he's pointing out is that this is one aspect of African American identity, period, right? That it did not just start 10 years ago with, I don't even know their names, Carnell and them, right? That this has been something that has been expressed, and we can, the research that I study, for example, there's a lot of smoke between African Americans and West Indians in the 19-teens and 1920s. And so I think the I think that the sort of Latinx Latino question is just one enunciation of it, but like as you pointed out, Haitians are immigrants that are extremely brutalized and that are suffered some of the most brutal, not only legal treatment, but also like physical treatment, as we saw last year with the sort of situation around what was the Rio Grande. And if we have xenophobic and nativist sentiment, we don't give a fuck about those Black people either, right? We're just kind of like, we anti-immigrant, so fuck them too. And also it's like, Latinos taking your job. You ain't got no job, Tommy. You ain't got no job. If it can be taken, it wasn't yours. So move on. You know what I'm saying? And also this idea, it reminds me of, super exploitation in Black people in the first half of the 20th century, because low wages brings everybody's wages down. You might make more than undocumented folks, but they bring wages down in general. They bring the standard of living down in general, right? And so that's what we always have to keep in mind, is that, and certainly I think it's like, we don't want to reproduce white supremacy in our own sort of understandings of the quote unquote others, right? Especially quote unquote others from without. Like, we don't want to do that. And so I think, so obviously Glenn, he was spot on, and we see the maturation of that nativism and that xenophobia and that myopia with these movements that we mentioned,
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I think he not necessarily just predicting ADOS or FBA. I mean, I'm not really interested in getting into any kind of diaspora war with him, if that's even if it's even worthy of calling it that. But I'm saying the conditions were there then, and like you said in the 1910s, like these conditions have been laid for a while. So when a group arises, regardless of how we feel about it, like an ADOS or an FBA, for people who don't know what those things are, they're groups that are focused exclusively on so-called African Americans or descendants of slaves, American descendants of slaves. That's what ADOS stands for. But those conditions were ripe.
Which is to say, thinking with Layla, it's U.S. descendants of U.S. enslaved Africans, because 90% of those enslaved went to the Caribbean and to Latin America. So if you talk about these literally American descendants of slaves, it will count the Brazilians and everybody else. So it's like even the name is a misnomer. It would be U.S. based descendants of John Turner's plantation. I'm just like that.
But yeah, these people don't have any real sense of like geography. So for them, it's the borders. I mean, they want to shut down the borders, and in a way, those type of claims are ways of drawing borders. Like that's what you're doing. So it's like the conditions were there. I guess I'm saying the conditions were there for that. So it's interesting because I read this piece too when I was trying to figure out what I was gonna talk about, and it was interesting just to see how he was able to calculate like these elements exist, and he was just honest about it. Because I think we're also in an age where sometimes we don't want to criticize Black people as a group, not just the elites, but just as a group sometimes, because it can come off reactionary or right wing. But like we were saying earlier, Blackness doesn't have some inherent like perfection or radicalness to it that somehow keeps it away from these type of tendencies. Like we are just as susceptible to this shit as anybody else. We've lived here all this time. Like we're just as susceptible to all this bullshit. So it's not a matter of saying what's authentic and what's not, or what's Black and what's not. Black people are just as susceptible to reactionary, nativism, all kinds, anti-immigrant sentiments. And it's not just because there's something wrong with us or anything. It's like the conditions drive you towards that, right? So you already working shitty jobs, and then, again, somebody comes in and capital gives them jobs too to compete against you on a lower level. You feel like the little bit that you had going on, they take that from you. I mean, this is the same thing that white people say about us. I'm saying that's just the way capitalism functions. But, it pits workers against each other. But then we end up blaming the other workers, instead of capital. And then that becomes the argument. So I'm saying we're all susceptible to that. I think he points that out well. And I just wanted to know, just for fun, that he called Claude Anderson a book promoting fog blower. I just found that to be funny.
I think though the other thing that he kind of dog whistles and doesn't talk about as much, when he says that our understandings are often obscured by our misunderstandings or lack of understandings of the context in which people are coming from. What people have to understand, which we frequently do not, is that no matter how shitty the conditions of life that we might have in the US, however better the conditions of life that we live under in the US are than all of these other places, are because of these imperial wars, right? And so the US as a country, for so many people has literally made living in their homelands all but impossible, because they've destroyed economies, right? They've made it unsafe. MS-13, and I do not want to conflate all immigrants with gang activity or whatever, but MS-13, which the Republicans love to talk shit about, is a gang. It's an El Salvadorian gang that was formed in the U.S.
U.S. prisons in particular. So it's the confluence of imperialism and carcerality. It literally forms in U.S. prisons, where a lot of these Latinx folks were sent for being undocumented, in addition to committing crimes.
And much like our own understandings of the way gangs developed in the US, they were created to protect themselves. In the 70s and 80s, MS-13 was created as a gang to protect themselves as immigrants because of their already precarious condition. Over time, they become, a serious sort of criminal organization that the US then decides to continue to deport back to El Salvador, which then creates a new influx of immigrants because so many people for generations have been tied up in the criminal gang organization of MS-13 in the US that are being shipped back. Life there in El Salvador becomes unlivable in a lot of ways. And so people are looking for someone. So this is a vicious cycle, right? And so this is just one specific case of that, but we have to understand all of the ways that that US imperial domination and interest are creating unlivable lives elsewhere in the world, as much as we are living unlivable lives in the US, right? And so what really needs to happen, as I think Glen Ford is that we need to understand our times, we need to understand the context, and we need to understand the historical moments that brought us here, and we got to see who our real enemies are, right? And we have to understand the nature of the beast that we're fighting, and that it ain't the other people that's scraping for crumbs with us.
It's up to Black folks ourselves to have some sort of political, right, sophistication, and really disaggregate the category of Latino ourselves to really discern sort of allies, right? Because folks immigrating from El Salvador, Honduras, Mexico are different than them white Cubans in Miami, period. Or the sort of reactionary diasporas that can also come from places like Venezuela, people who are fleeing socialism, right? And so it does not behoove us to lump all Latino folks as into this brown sort of category that's taking our jobs, nor either should we assume that it's a monolithic group of allies. And I think that that's to your point, Layla, where you're saying that there's different racial categories and different sort of ethnic groups that make up the category of Latino. And so we also need to be discerning and pay attention to, because, Marco Rubio and Ted Cruz are real, right? But they don't determine the group of Latino, just like, we need to take them seriously as well in the ways that they might align with against our own interests, our being oppressed, exploited, working and poor people, right?
Yeah, and I think it's important that we also know, and this is maybe to that point. So Ben Vinson has an interesting, but I forget the title of it, but he writes about this community of Afro-Mexicans that migrated to Winston-Salem, North Carolina. And a part of what happens is that after a generation, particularly when the language is lost, they just get read as Black folks, right? And they are Black folks, but in terms of the census and other kinds of, they don't get understood as immigrants, and they don't get so then we often don't understand the way that their status as both Black and immigrant creates a different confluence of dynamics for them, right? And so I think that we have to be able to be attentive to these differences and these similarities, right? And I think it's because in the cases of like Venezuela and Cuba, we largely are not seeing the Black populations migrate out. And part of the reason why is because largely the Black populations there are benefiting from the changes, the aspirational socialism that's taking place there in ways that they're not in these other countries like Mexico, El Salvador, Nicaragua, whatever, right? And so we have to understand all of these different dynamics that are influencing I don't even want to call them migration choices, because often it's not a choice, but that are influencing these migratory patterns and the reasons why we see certain people coming from certain places. And we have to understand what our biases are about these categories of immigrants, and particularly why we don't necessarily see Black immigrants in the same way.
I think the related to that also is like the question of remittances and who is sending remittances back that allow people to travel and leave, which is also highly racialized, right? So I think that both of those dynamics are important.
Yeah, I mean, I don't really have much to add. I think we were just talking about how, you know, most Africans did not come to the United States as we know it today. So that would also mean that, you know, there are other racial dynamics outside of the United States, and it would behoove us to understand that, even within whether we're talking about African immigrants from other countries, or even when we're talking about people who will identify as brown when they get here. You know, racism operates in so many different types of ways, and race plays out, you know, it even has an identity in so many different types of ways. So people are not arriving here with the same understanding that we may have. But Americanism in general, or American exceptionalism, tends to universalize itself as the experience. So even Black people sometimes are inflicted with that same problem of universalizing our Black experience, whatever that is, as the universal experience. And then if somebody doesn't necessarily relate to it in that way, we somehow think they're undermining us, you know, or undermining our struggle or something of that nature. And sometimes, I'm not saying that doesn't happen, because it does, like, but I'm saying sometimes there is just differences, and you need to have some context to that. And you can't solely understand it through the American view. Like that's a very parochial way of looking at it.
Basically, the lesson that we need to learn: just we don't got to be like the whites. We don't got to replicate their same mistakes. We got our own mistakes that we can make. So we need to learn from that shit, and don't be the same. Don't be trash in the same ways.
All right, y'all. I just have a quick and dirty rant, which is really actually not a rant. The fuck is this? I just feel offended that our beloved Glen Ford's Black Agenda, okay, his book is called The Black Agenda, is going to be inevitably subsumed under this particular book, The Black Agenda, which just dropped. It has a blurb from Ibram Kendi. And I haven't read through this, and you know, I am certain there's some good shit in here, okay? But this is much more in line with mainstream conversations than the very important work of this Black Agenda, okay? And you just know how that goes. What is inside of these pages that we all need to be reading, not just the 10 Black people on the left, is ultimately going to be replaced by this Black Agenda. And ain't that just a fucking metaphor for how Black politics work? The mainstream Black Agenda always subsumes, co-ops, overshadows the Black agenda that we actually need to be paying attention to. So I'm just pressed. I'm salty. I'm a little bit annoyed by this Black Agenda dropping when we still haven't even had the full engagement that this Black Agenda deserves. So who published this? St. Martin's Press, you're raggedy.
All right, so before we get out of here, we have one special announcement to let you all know. So CBS and I have been invited to collaborate with Monthly Review Press to highlight some of their classic Black radical left Pan-Africanist, internationalist thinkers. And so over the course of 2022, we will be doing a reading series, which actually we decided we're going to do kind of like a work study series with Monthly Review Press. So the first book that we will read with Monthly Review Press will be Conscientism by Kwame Nkrumah. That work study session will take place on March 13th. And then the second and third will be later in the year. They'll be in June and October, and we'll be reading Walter Rodney and Amilcar Cabral. So we will be sure to keep you posted, and we will give you more information, but we just wanted to let you know about that special collaboration. And we hope to see some of you all there, and definitely pick up the books to read. So like I said, the first is Niceness by Kwame Nkrumah. All right, y'all. So we had a good, long, thoughtful episode. We hope you enjoyed. That is our show for this Friday evening. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you chose to be here with us. So thanks as always for tuning in. I'm Dr. Layla Brown here with my girl, Dr. CBS. Thanks as always to Two Black in the Back, and we're signing off.
And Jemima.
Peace.